But since the effects has been exaggerated, especially in the past few years, United States has been in the process of deleveraging. And that process potentially is very dangerous. You cannot let it to have the free fall. That is why in the process you need to pop it up a little bit, so far what we have seen is 3 sessions of quantitative easing for a good reason. And years down the road, the challenge for the United States is to continue to push the frontier of knowledge. United States continue to be in the best position to push the frontier of knowledge given the quality of its university education. Compared with the United States, European countries probably are less competitive. Given the aging of population in Europe, I'm less optimistic about Europe than the United States. But with the horizon of substituting traditional energy with shale gas, there you probably see some light in terms of getting the economy in this country more competitive if you lower the cost of energy vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So I guess the prospects for the United States probably is to go through a process of reindustrialization with a greener economy, with energy at lower cost. But that, if anything happens, that won't happen immediately. It will be in consideration for at least intermediate and the long term. The prospects for China, so far, so good. Now, if we look at the first equation, 1.3 billion people multiplied by technology, I guess what is important for China now, years down the road, is not only to learn technology defined as hardware technology, but also to learn institutional technology. Because for China to accomplish the status of a mature market has to be supported by rule of law. So far, what we have done is rule by law, to say the most. It is not a system based of rule of law. And of course, there are others. But more importantly, we say our reform is a market-oriented reform. But so far, what we have achieved is a marketization of factors of product, goods and services, not marketization of factors of production. For us to look at the human history, to move from a village economy to a modern economy, it is marketization of factors of production first. Then marketization of goods and services is just a derivative of the first round of marketization. But in the Chinese case, we have reversed the sequence. We have marketized the goods and the services without marketization of factors of production. The political power continue to control in a very significant degree factors of production, such that when someone has access on the one hand to power, behind that is the factors of production, and on this hand is markets of goods and services, it is so easy for that someone to get rich and very rich. But those institutional arrangements, I was talking about institutional technology, good technology, bad technology. Those kind of institutional arrangements are not going to allow the bulk of population, the majority of the population, to get rich simultaneously. Because power, the nature of power, by definition, is few. If everyone has power, no one has power. So for political power to continue to hold factors of production, there are negative consequences, primarily in two ways. One is it is going to drive apart the gap between rich and the poor. The other is it is going to give rise to the problem of corruption. If you have a wealth gap, then you will have problems of supply and demand. For the Chinese economy to move forward prior to the crisis of the world financial crisis, our demand side was helped by international markets. With the world economy slowing down, with the pushing of the frontier slowing down, we need to find internal demand for the potential supply side growth. If we look at this picture, for us to continue to close the gap between China and countries like the United States, it is not difficult to see the growth potentials in terms of supply side. But for the economy to move forward, you need to have some reasonable match between supply side growth and the demand side growth. But without the growth, demand side growth, your economy will be in trouble. And this is the greatest challenge that the Chinese economy will face. So in a very fundamental way, we need to address the institutional arrangements or institutional technology that would find a better alignment between markets of services and goods and also markets of factors of production. Without achieving that better alignment, in spite of the policy objectives that China has announced, those will remain policy objectives. It will be very difficult to accomplish in reality. And there, I would argue, in the context of China-US relations, China needs to continue to have a very strong interface with the United States so that we have a better chance not only to learn technology in terms of hardware, but more important that also to learn institutional technologies so that China has a better chance to move its economy forward. Otherwise, we'll face the prospects of a so-called middle income trap. To wrap up, the Chinese GDP in aggregate amount now is number 2 in the world. But measured in GDP per capita, we continue to be below world average. It is now somewhere around 5,000 GDP per capita. For China to move out of that negative prospects of middle income trap, we need to go beyond 12,000 GDP per capita. Even when we achieve that level, if you look at the models, that model won't say that China has a better growth model than the models of advanced economies, unless we achieve a GDP per capita level above 30,000 US dollars. But given the resources we have, we probably will never achieve that. So for me to go back to the simple model, growth is a function of people multiplied by technology, given resources, given peace. It's easy for us to say, given resources and given peace, but in reality, these two variables are not given. That is why, I guess, one of the purpose of this conference is also to look at some potential hotspots like North Korea. So the world system is complicated, and because it's complicated, it is also very fragile. There are things that we cannot take for granted. And with that, I'm going to stop my talk, and I'm willing to answer whatever questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your wonderful talk. I had two questions in mind. You mentioned that the growth story is dependent upon people and technology, and China has done very well on hardware, and it has not done very well on institutional technologies. So I was wondering, what is the reason behind that China has not done well on institutional and software technologies? And the other question, you mentioned about the American growth story now dependent on the shale gas reserves which we have discovered in America. Do you think then China can commit to, China can move over that gap and commit to renewable technologies and then shorten that gap between developed and emerging countries? What are your thoughts on renewable energy?
Industrialization actually is a process of commercialization of better ideas. Before that, you have a process called enlightenment. You have a process called scientific revolution. You have better ideas. And then industrialization is sort of a commercialization or give material dimension to better ideas. When China had an encounter with the Western world, it is the process of commercialization of ideas. My observation is that so far we have learned the commercialization of some deep ideas at the physical level, and we have been systematic in terms of learning of enlightenment, scientific revolution. When we say the phrase 科学, translated as science, the idea we have or the substance we have hidden behind the phrase 科学 is different from the substance you would have. So that when we Chinese say it is a scientific mode of development, you would be at loss to understand, what do you mean? And the science in China has a very strong normative notion. If something is good, then it has to be scientific. But according to scientific calculation, the solar system will collapse. This is not good. But it's scientific prediction, right? The other way of looking at the normative notion of science in China is that, now if you think something good, then it's scientific, but who is there to judge something is good? So what I'm driving at is that the concept of science, or your concept of science, is not systematic in China, even though we have been learning science for the last 100 years. So that is why during the latter part of industrialization, when we have had an interface with Western economies, we learn the physical dimension without the way of thinking. What is science? What is scientific knowledge? That is why early on I cited on Thomas Kuhn, you must have a puzzle, a box of tools, give structure to phenomena, hypothesis, testing hypothesis. So our concept of is science, according to my observation, is different from yours. Institutional technology are technologies that do not come with a strong physical dimension. They tend to be metaphysical, rule of law. What does that mean? But a good institutional technology tend to be based on brilliant ideas, systematic knowledge. If you look at the history of constitutionalism, Constitution in the United States, you look at Declaration of Independence. It starts with, we hold these to be self-evident. In more technical terms, we hold these to be axiomatic. It's like a body of mathematics. You start from axioms, then logarithms, then theorems, then first order theorem, the second order theorem, in the hope that you build in a systematic way. Then you add with so-called helpers. We may be wrong, but this is the best way so far to go. These are the things that are very difficult to learn. It's not like you have the piece of equipment you to do reverse engineering, right? How many people in the world have done reverse engineering of mathematics? Very few people. Gödel did, so that he found, for all we have tried in that body of knowledge called mathematics, it is incomplete. But then his way of looking at institutional technology, he was going through a process of immigration, and he was interviewed by an immigration officer. Where are you from? Austria. Why did you leave your country? Nominally that was a republican, but it turned out to be a dictatorship. Then the immigration officer said, I'm sorry to hear that. That won't happen in this country, in the United States. And the girl replied, Sir, I have studied your constitution. I have studied your institutional technology. In other words, I can prove it can also happen. Very few people would have the intellectual power to see the loopholes of that beautiful edifice we call Constitution. So that indicates it's very difficult to learn institutional technologies, but institutional technologies are there. A market is based on market itself is institutional technology, right? Civil service examination is institutional technology. China was first to build that institutional technology. We used 500 years to initiate that system, to improve that system, and that system matured during Song Dynasty. But from then on, there are no significant institutional technologies that we have created to push our system in a systematic way ahead of other countries. And that, in a roundabout way, also answer your second part of the question. Yes.
Hello. Thank you so much, Professor Fu. Two questions. One, I'm interested in the inequality piece, and you touched on it a tiny bit when you talked about wealth gap. And you said there needs to be a better alignment between the markets of goods and services and the markets of factors of production. Now, I admit I'm definitely not an economist. So I was wondering if you could just explain what that means? Secondly, I'd love to hear your opinion or analysis on the direction of China's growth, given the enormous social and environmental costs that the growth has incurred. I mean, you started your talk with saying, 200 years ago, China was 1/3 of the world population and 1/3 of the world's GDP. Do you think, would you like to see China be now 1/5 the world's population, 1/5 the world's GDP? I mean, is that the level of growth, the kind of growth, the direction of growth that you would like to see? Thank you.
To try the second part of the question, for Chinese economy to approach level of United States in terms of GDP per capita, it's impossible. That would take, by a rough calculation, about 4 Earths to accomplish that. This is impossible given the knowledge we have, unless we suddenly tap into dark matter, dark energy, then you open up another horizon. I say, given the knowledge that we have so far. But human beings are strange animals. Before industrialization, life was roughly about the same everywhere. Then it's industrialization. Then you open up horizons, so much so that the philosopher Hegel had this concept, or he emphasized the concept of a history being progressive. And when he said that, and when he read the Chinese history, his conclusion was Chinese concept of history was ahistorical. It's a repetition of the same thing. So I guess now we probably see a prospect that history probably is not as progressive as Hegel would have hoped. He, of course, was during early years of industrialization. But I tend not to agree with him. I have the confidence that the intellectual power of human beings. The universe is vast. There are more things that awaits us for us to discover. But as I said, given the stock of knowledge so far, it is impossible. Inequality. Market itself can explain a certain level of inequality, since the nature of market is competitive. Competitive means there is a difference. But now, for Gini coefficiency in China to approach or probably exceed the level of 0.5, you have to look for additional variables to explain that. The United States is a mature marketplace. The level is less than that. My argument is that we have to look at the lack of marketization of factors of production. I guess it's Simon, a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He said, since he was talking about state-owned enterprise and the private firms, the difference between the two. He was saying, in both cases, since we all work for others, that means, logically, there should not be big difference between state-owned enterprises and the private firms. But if empirically we observe differences, then we need to look for additional sets of axioms. Somewhat illuminated by Simon's idea, what are the additional axioms? In the case of China, I would argue, all else being equal. Yes, we all work for others, so if you sort of use micro reasoning, we as economic person, we are self-interested, we are rational, we are utility maximizer. If labor and the capital is the same person, this is fine. There is no delinkage of that logic. But since we all work for others, why there should be a difference between state-owned enterprises and the private firms? Then if you say the set of axioms is in state-owned enterprises is different from the set of axioms in private firms, then in the case of China, I would argue, all else being equal, state-owned enterprises are just an extension of the hierarchy, the bureaucracy. And since the bureaucracy, as I argued, continue to hold the factors of production, land, labor, capital, all else being equal, you cannot compete. Private firms cannot compete with the state-owned enterprises. It's not because state-owned enterprises are performing better. It's because they have an extra advantage. But that advantage would come at the cost of the rest of society. So in other words, behind the seemingly better performance measured in cash, they get enormous subsidies from the rest of society. And over time, their system will be efficient. But short term, that would drive apart the wealth gap between rich and the poor. Now, this is the logic. Empirically, have we observed that? Well, now we have very compelling empirical evidences to support that hypothesis. So that's why I make an argument.
Thank you, Dr. Fujun. My question is about Chinese government's plan for urbanization to increase domestic demand.
You ask me to comment on that?
Yes.
We have a uniquely Chinese concept we call peasant workers, 农民工. I guess in Europe, in the United States, there was a process called urbanization, where people from countryside moving into cities. But during that process, did you have that concept, that category called 农民工? No? I was talking about marketization of factors of production. One factor is labor. Physically, now if you travel to China, physically you can observe labor is free. They can move, peasants can move from countryside to cities to work as construction workers. So you say, okay, there is a movement of labor. But it's a very conditional movement. When peasants move, they do not move with their economic and political rights. They move countryside to cities to work on a short-term basis, to engage in construction work. Once that's done, they need to move back to the countryside. And the implication for that is that systematically depress wage rates, for one thing. And which in turn will give rise to mismatch between supply and the demand side. And that is why so far the Chinese economy increasingly would have the state to continue to inject money into the system. In other words, the system is not propped by a natural demand on the part of a household. Years down the road, for us to have to increase domestic demand, one way is to continue urbanization of that type. But clearly, that won't sustain the process. So for the next 5 years or 10 years, for China to continue urbanization, it has to be an urbanization with a strong human dimension. In other words, when peasants move from countryside to cities, they should move not just with their physical body. The movement of their physical body should also come with economic and the political rights. In other words, we need to work very hard to reduce and to get rid of that uniquely Chinese system called hukou, residential card system. Otherwise, urbanization won't systematically increase domestic demand. If anything else, it is a accumulation, like a time bomb, of the social tensions that China will face, not long term, probably just intermediate term. In 5 years, it's like a time bomb waiting to explode. For the first generation of so-called peasant workers to move to cities to engage in construction work, psychologically probably it was okay for them to accept those conditions, the conditions without economic and political rights. Now, their kids are being born with kids of urbanites. They grew up together. For second generation, they won't accept those artificially policy conveyed disadvantage or deprivation of their political rights. I guess the same logic historically took place here in the United States. I guess it's the kids of second generation or third generation of immigrants that give rise to civil rights movements. And then we hear the voice of Martin Luther King. I have a dream, I have a dream. So that you have very powerful civil rights movements to do away with those discrimination.
Because of 10 minutes.